Alrighty. Thank you guys for making it here. I'm Steve Nam, the managing editor of the Stanford Journal of Blockchain Law and Policy. I'll just begin with a quick preamble. The late, great political philosopher John Rawls, in his approach to political liberalism, underscored the importance of legitimacy and stability in the governance of a pluralist society. Legitimacy in traditional corporate governance systems is founded upon the ultimate shared goal of profit. Stability in traditional political governance systems is often propped up by the difficulty of exit. This is meaningful for decentralized governance. Because, frankly, it isn't so beholden in either respect. But at the same time, its new sources of legitimacy and stability need not reinvent every wheel. Lessons from existing corporate and political governance systems can be retrofitted for decentralized governance system purposes, better suited to pluralist societies in flux. So without further ado, we have our distinguished speakers. Each will have 20 minutes to present, and we'll follow with Q&A. And please feel free to also introduce yourselves at the start. Thanks so much. Okay, Summer.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Summer Kim, and I teach at the UC Irvine School of Law. And I couldn't have asked for a better segue because the topic that I'm talking about today is corporate personhood and how we have used the conception of a person in corporate law and to think about what extensions could be made to machine-human interactions in the intelligence age. So to begin, I'll speak on three topics. First, the question of are corporations people? I'll introduce you to some of the seminal cases as well as the theories that have been used to advance corporate personhood. And then we'll talk about what's at stake, some of the challenges and difficulties of setting the boundaries of personhood. And lastly, I'll talk about a few extensions to artificial entities and autonomous agents in the intelligence age. So many of you in this room are probably familiar with Hobby Lobby, which is an American arts and crafts store with more than 32,000 employees and 800 stores in the United States. The owners of Hobby Lobby are the Greens, David and Barbara Green, who are evangelical Christians. And the Greens took a public stance against a provision in the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, ACA or Obamacare, that mandates that companies of a certain size or larger include contraceptives in their health coverage for employees. And it was actually Hobby Lobby and two other companies that were a part of the suit, and not the Greens, that sued to argue that the contraceptive mandate in the ACA violated the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act provides that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion unless that restriction is the least restrictive means to furthering a compelling governmental purpose. So this begs the question of, is Hobby Lobby a person? And if it is, does it have religious freedoms? And the answer to both of those questions was yes. The Supreme Court held in a 5-4 opinion that Greens have a constitutional right to refuse to provide their employees the required contraceptive care benefits, and businesses can hold religious views under the eyes of the law, especially in cases where there is essentially no difference between the owners and its owners. So this is the aggregate theory of corporate personhood, where we view corporations as an aggregation of the members that constitute the corporation. And so Hobby Lobby has all of the rights that its members and its owners, the Greens, have. The pushback to the aggregate theory is that, in a sense, this aggregate theory is inconsistently applied. Right? For purposes of liability, right? the Greens are able to enjoy separateness, right? So if there was an accident at a Hobby Lobby store, the victims could sue the entity, but not go after the personal assets of the Greens. So if there is a shield that exists for purposes of the corporation's liabilities, they shouldn't then be able to attach their religious beliefs to the corporation. And this was the dissent in Hobby Lobby, but Justice Ginsburg wrote in her dissent, and if we were to believe that corporations were aggregations of individuals, so they should enjoy the rights of the individual members, what about the rights of the employees? They have a constitutional right to this care as well. So this is one example of the aggregate theory, but you can see some of its limitations in just this one example. Another well-known case is Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission, a 2010 case where Citizens United, a nonprofit organization, argued that a federal law prohibiting corporations and unions from using their general treasury funds to make independent expenditures for speech, that is an electioneering communication or forced speech that expressly advocates the election or defeat of a candidate, was unconstitutional. Here too, it was a 5-4 decision holding that the First Amendment does apply to corporations. Political spending is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment, and that the government may not keep corporations or unions from spending money to support or denounce individual candidates in elections. Here, the theory that was used was a little bit different from the aggregate theory in Hobby Lobby. This case stands for the idea that the corporation is a separate entity, an independent entity from its members, and that they have these rights which are separate and independent from their members' rights. The pushback to the real entity theory is that corporations have no conscience, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. This is language from the dissent that Justice Stevens authored. And in response to Citizens United, there has been a proposal that's being floated around for a constitutional amendment that declares that only natural persons are persons under the US Constitution. So these were some of the difficult cases where there was much debate. And I wanted to show you that the question of whether or not a corporation should be viewed as a person under the eyes of the law is not always a very difficult question. There are some cases for which the answer is an easy yes. For example, in the New York Times versus United States case of 1971, the government tried to stop the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing the leaked Pentagon Papers. There, the Supreme Court held that the government had not met its burden of showing justification for imposition of restraint on publication. An example of an easy no case is the FCC v. AT&T, where AT&T argued, relying on the statute's exception for personal privacy, that information about its finances should be excluded from the Freedom of Information Act request. This argument was unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice Roberts ridiculed in his opinion, the personal privacy exception does not extend to corporations, and we trust that AT&T will not take it personally. And there are those easy cases, but some of the harder ones, like Hobby Lobby and Citizens United, have led to the power being derived from corporate personhood being used to advantage the financial and managerial elites. And John Coates at Harvard Law has described the corporate takeover of First Amendment protections as a specific form of legal corruption. And another problem is that corporations have actually displaced natural persons as beneficiaries of fundamental rights. Adam Winkler of UCLA finds that the very same justices who decided that corporations had rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment refused to read the Constitution as protecting the rights of African Americans, who are the real intended beneficiaries of the 14th Amendment. So this is to say that giving corporations personhood as a matter of convenience, what one could call the easy cases, has actually opened the floodgates for the harder and sometimes even wrong cases. And in my view, I think the better approach would be to regulate corporations as things. Right? The answer to the question of which rights are incidental to the corporate purpose should not hinge on the determination of whether or not corporations are persons, and we should just acknowledge the fact that corporations are not among we the people by and for whom the Constitution exists, and perhaps a clearer solution would be to rely on a chartering authority and substantive corporate law to delineate corporate rights and duties. And so I think this is maybe the fixed mindset of a lawyer, where I think the slippery slope of giving corporations personhood, which initially began as a very logical step in the right direction, right? In order to facilitate commerce, we needed corporations to be able to enter into contracts, to be able to own property, to be able to sue and to be sued. And so it made a lot of sense to, at least through a legal fiction, give them some semblances of a person, acknowledging that they are not natural persons and they are artificial legal entities. But then once that opening, giving them that inch, led them to taking a mile. I think that result is the bizarre and unusual outcome that I wanted to highlight to show how when we want to take away those bizarre results of constitutional rights being extended to corporations, the choice that I am left with, or that I suggest as the better way, is then reliance on a chartering authority, which is to rely on government regulation. And so I think that dichotomy does show that I have a little bit of a limited mindset, and I think this group is the group to talk to when we think about, is there then a third way, right? And not treat it as a binary between constitutional rights or government regulation on the other, but thinking about other ways to mediate between the easy and hard cases that come up in the corporate personhood debate. And so the lesson and the reason I shared this topic with you as I was thinking about the topic of today's presentation was that we have given corporations personhood as a matter of convenience, but that theory has been stretched to be used to replace and displace natural humans who are the intended beneficiaries of those very rights and protections. And the same story could potentially unfold if we prescribe new rights and obligations to artificially intelligent and autonomous agents, right? In the same way we had corporations that were built to realize economies of scale from team production. We have machines and smart contracts and code, right, that are being built by all of you in this room to perform intelligent tasks that are traditionally accomplished by humans, right? And so in the same way that we have very easily treated corporations as people to facilitate commerce, I've heard many of the same discussions starting to emerge as we think about how to treat these autonomous agents. And perhaps we should view them as people, not as equivalent to natural persons, but as some third category in order to facilitate innovation. And so this passage from Anna Lee Newitz's novel, Autonomous, although it may sound crazy if you read it, may be, right, something that we should be thinking if we look at, right, the bizarre and surprising ways in which the corporate personhood cases have turned out may not be too far from a future that we live in. So just to give a few examples, in the same way that I think it's the safer and clearer solution is to treat corporations as things, I think the same analogy would extend as we think about machines and other other machinery that is being used in this space to do the work of humans. So for instance, if we have a self-driving car, right, there are many ways that you could view it. Just coming back and bringing us back to the earlier theories that I introduced to you as being used to advance corporate personhood, if you view this car as just like you, but maybe a safer version of you, we might be comfortable with treating those things as having the rights of the humans that are associated with it. If we view it just as another driver, one that is separate from us, we may be comfortable bringing in the real entity theory and viewing it as a separate and independent entity with its own bank accounts, with its own liability, and with its own personhood for purposes of ascribing to it duties and obligations. Same thing with the use of robots in the workplace, right? Is it just like you but faster? Or do you view it as a colleague or a boss, as a subordinate? And at the end of the day, I think the lesson perhaps that corporate personhood could teach us is that these things and these technologies should be viewed as things that exist for us, and to limit their scope to their function, rather than to ascribe to them any notions of personhood. In the few minutes that I have, I just wanted to introduce a couple of related projects that I'm working on in this area. And so to the extent that we have time for discussion in the end, I'd love to hear your thoughts and to continue the conversation. A colleague of mine at UCI, we're thinking about how smart contracts can be used to solve some of the challenges in corporate governance as it relates to shareholder voting and also board transparency. And I think this very closely relates to Kevin's work, the third speaker on this panel. The reason I'm here is actually through joint work with Andrew Miller and a few of his graduate students. We're thinking about how we can use cryptographic commitments or tokens to change academic publishing, especially as it relates to law reviews. Also, with another colleague at UC Irvine, we're thinking about how to use biometrics to change the way we define how offers are made and accepted and what duties people have to actually read contracts. If there's a way to measure, right, through the movement of their irises and through their scrolling, whether they have actually read and how much time they spent reading, perhaps we no longer need to rely on judges to make approximations of what actually has been read, hasn't been read, what duties we impose on people to read, and so forth. And lastly, another joint project with a philosopher based out of Kangwon National University. We're thinking of how to use poetic methods and the use of metaphors in particular to teach machines to be better lawyers. So this is all to say, I think although my field is very distant from that of many of you in this room, I think there's a lot of interesting conversations for us to have. In the morning's talk, as I believe the speaker here was talking about transparency and how that's measured in terms of defining and disclosing conflicts of interest. That's certainly an area in which corporate lawyers and corporate law scholars struggle as we think about defining what it means for a board member to be independent. And it turns out, right, as we put more and more parameters on what disqualifies you as a board member because of these innate conflicts that you might have, the fewer and fewer informed people we actually have on boards to make meaningful decisions. So there's a lot of the themes that I heard over the course of the day, I think repeat themselves. So I think this is another way of saying that these talks don't exist in isolation. I think the very preceding panel on semantics and how each of us use words like who votes and how are votes counted and how is consensus reached really live in every one of our spaces. So I wanted to thank the organizers for bringing us all together and for giving me a chance to share a little bit of the things that I care about and throwing them to you in the hopes that they might inspire your thinking in the way that each of you do your own work. Thank you.